Hey guys, this is Nick Christophers from Mob Tales. Thanks for tuning in again. I know we were a little bit on hiatus for about a week or two. It was a Greek Easter actually, and me and Peter Greek, so that's why we weren't around. But today we have an interesting guest, Zach Jensen, who is an educational consultant, I believe, from the Mob Museum, if I'm correct. And Zach, thanks a lot for coming on, and we definitely appreciate it.
Hi, glad to be here.
Awesome. I'm gonna just tell a little. I mean, I know a little bit about what you do. I don't really know too much. Um, I know your title at the Mob Museum is educational specialist.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, a lot of people would be like, education, what does that got to do with the mob? They'd be like confused.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I know, granted, we're going to need to clarify that a little bit, but which is going to be part of some of my questions. And the first one would be, I know you graduated from, I think, University of Nevada, in,
Yes, that's
right?
correct.
And you studied paleontology.
Yes, I did.
And when I found that, I'm like, what the hell's that got to do with the mob? And I'm like, wait a minute. So I said, Zach's got to clear this up for me. So shoot, let me know how did that cross?
Yeah, I'm happy to explain that. So,
Okay.
uh, at the Mob Museum, I'm the education specialist, which means that I do research and writing for any educational material at the museum. So that's everything from exhibits to blogs. So I'm a writer and researcher for the museum, basically. And I've come quite a long ways to get to being a historian for the museum. Like you said, I originally was in paleontology. That's where I come from, science. And I got my undergrad in geology, so with my master's degree there as well at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And as I was teaching geology, that was my career, and I wanted to get another job. I got a part-time job at the Mob Museum. And one thing I really liked about the Mob Museum working there part-time is, it's a history museum, but there's also science in there as well. And I really embraced that. So the Mob Museum has a crime lab, which is all about forensic science. And I was really drawn to that. But throughout the museum, there's other things. For example, when talking about the St. Valentine's Day massacre, that's one of the early cases where forensic ballistics was used to solve the crime. So that's something that really drew me towards the Mob Museum. And as I got further and further into working at the Mob Museum, I started to fall in love with the subject matter. And when the opportunity came to work full time for the Mob Museum, I took it because I really had developed a passion for the subject matter. You know, I I've traded in my scientist shoes for historian shoes, and I never looking back, just trading Earth history for human history.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. So did your knowledge of paleontology give you, I mean, that scientific end of it, like you just
Mhm.
said, did that, how did that transition into something like this, which is, about the mob,
Yeah.
it's a whole different animal. No pun intended. How did that, how were you able to transition to one subject into a totally different other subject?
Well, when I was doing paleontology, my bread and butter was research and writing. As a scientist, that's what you do is, you look really deep into a subject and then you write about it to tell people about it. Sometimes that involves experimentation. Sometimes it's going out into the field and, looking at what's out there and bringing back out and telling people about it. And I found that history is very similar. Instead of going out into the rocks and studying those, you're, diving into historical documents, journals, newspapers. It's a different kind of lab, but the skills that it takes to be successful are very similar. So I was able to take those skills as a scientist and translate them very easily into being a historian. And I love what I do now.
Well, you mentioned something about the crime lab at the Mob
Mhm.
Museum. I mean, I
Yes.
visited the Mob Museum, and I mean, Jonathan or Jeff didn't show me this crime lab.
Mhm.
I'm a little bit curious now. What is that? I mean, is that open? Is that, did the public see that or no? I don't remember that being part of the tour. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the Mob Museum, we have a few additional experiences that our guests can purchase. One of those is the Crime Lab, in addition to our distillery tour and our use of force experience. So, the Crime Lab is, like I said, all about forensic science. It's a special exhibit where our guests can explore various areas of forensic science. That can be things like death investigation. We have a digital autopsy table in there. We also have DNA analysis, fingerprint analysis, and firearms examination, comparing bullets to see which gun fired which bullet. So, that's something that's a very science heavy field, but it also applies directly to the history that we talk about at the Mob Museum, because, a lot of these cases involving mobsters were solved thanks to these techniques in forensic science. And so we display some of those in the crime lab that our guests can explore.
Well, in reference to that, because I found that's pretty interesting,
Mhm,
um, a topic rather, because a lot of times people are very confused about, when you hear, watching on TV and stuff, ballistic report, DNA, all these other situations that help crack a case, for example.
mhm.
So for people who are not very familiar with ballistics, like, okay, I know it involves bullets and stuff like that. And can you give us a little more deeper understanding of what, when an officer or detective talks about, oh, we have to get the ballistics to find out, where the bullets what bullets were used, were they used for another crime?
Mhm.
How does that work?
So there's a principle in forensic science that's every contact leaves a trace. So you can't go anywhere without leaving some kind of evidence that you've been there. So that could be your DNA left at the crime scene. It could be your fingerprints. In the case of firearms, if you fire a gun, there's going to be markings on those bullets that can tell an investigator which gun fired that bullet. So, if you're a mobster and you shoot a guy and throw away the gun, well, if our investigators can find that gun, well, then you're caught red-handed.
Well, and sometimes, well, we all know that sometimes, if they're using pistols, rifle, whatever, serial numbers can be scratched off. They
Mhm,
can erase the serial numbers. If they use certain kinds of bullets, like dum-dum bullets, for example, sometimes they don't leave. Sometimes those bullets don't have any serial numbers on them. There's certain ways of them getting away with that, where they can hide. Sometimes I've heard where ballistics didn't come up with anything.
yeah.
Now, with what I just said, would that be the case?
So, there's a lot of ways that criminals try and hide their tracks, by filing off serial numbers. But that is not perfect because, in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the forensic scientist in charge of that investigation, Dr. Calvin Goddard, he restored the serial numbers on the firearms involved by using a special acid solution. So they tried to get rid of those serial numbers, but it didn't work because he was able to figure them out anyway. And, if you fire a bullet in any kind of gun, a pistol, a rifle that has rifling inside that barrel, those are going to leave markings on the bullet that you can't just make go away. So those markings are going to tell an investigator which gun fired that bullet as long as they can find that gun to compare it to.
Interesting. Okay, this isn't now different subject when it comes to DNA.
Mhm,
Now that's a whole other animal. Um, now when it comes to DNA, I know sometimes you read cases or articles, whatever, that are about certain cases, and they say, yeah, well, the DNA matched this individual or it matched that individual. Now, can DNA be tampered with, where they can say, like, let's sake of argument, I'm just giving you for instance.
mhm.
Let's say John Doe shot Joe Schmo, for example, and they used somebody else's DNA because they really wanted to get John Doe really bad, and they wanted to use this DNA to prove that it was him. You know what I'm saying? In other words, tampering with it. Do you think that happens? Do you think that can happen? or is that possible?
So that's a good question. DNA is a pretty solid science. It's very difficult to try and game DNA in that way. You know, everybody has unique DNA. No two people, except for identical twins, will have the same DNA. And so, you know, if someone tries to tamper with a DNA sample, well, when the investigators run those through the crime lab in the DNA lab, uh, there's going to be signs in there that that DNA is contaminated and they can't use that sample. So, you know, the science is sound. You're going to be able to see whether that's a clean DNA sample or it isn't. And if it isn't, you just can't use it as evidence, you know. So in science, it's hard to lie about those kinds of things. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. Now getting back to the mob museum and
Mhm.
yourself, um, when you were younger, before you even got involved with the mob museum, was a mob in general the subject ever of interest?
You know, what interested me were the movies. You know, growing up watching things like The Godfather and Goodfellas, you know, seeing it on TV, it was something that was interesting to me. It was something I had been exposed to, but never in a million years did I think that I would be a historian for the Mob Museum. You know, sometimes I wish I could go back in time and tell young high school Zach what you got in store for yourself in the future. He'd be very excited, but yeah, he had no idea, you know, watching The Godfather as a 16-year-old, that that is what you'd be studying as your career.
Yeah, that is pretty odd. Well, now since being with the mob museum, you've been there for like what, how long now so far?
6 years.
6 years. So obviously now you're obviously very much, adapted to it and the whole thing. When you first started and you got involved with it, on a full-time basis, um, what did you, I'm sure, like, I'm a mob historian myself, I'm a mob
Mhm,
expert, and I know a little too much. Only because I was, me, not so much only because I read about it. I was around those guys. I grew up with it.
mhm,
I got in trouble when I was a kid, so I was really in touch with it, on a street level. Now, for yourself, which I don't think you were involved street level, I don't think so. But how did how were you able to, so to speak, catch up with all this? I mean, there's so much to know. It's just
mhm.
unbelievable. It's incredible. So how were you able to catch up? I mean, you must have been immersed in books. Forget about it. Fill the room. How did you do that?
Well, let me tell you, I'm still catching up 6 years in. You
I'm
know,
sure.
it's such a huge subject matter, but that's what's exciting about it, is there's so many different things that you can dive into. You know, I'm the kind of person I like new and shiny subjects. I like to dive into new things every couple months just to keep things fresh. And so, you know, when I was in year one as a museum educator at the Mob Museum, I just started bit by bit. You know, I explored the exhibits in our museum. You know, fortunately, the Mob Museum is very thorough throughout its 4 floors of exhibits. You know, starting from the early history of the mob, you know, getting started during Prohibition, turning into a national crime syndicate, and growing over time. You know, coming to Las Vegas, and you know, all the way up until when law enforcement starts to get the tools to combat organized crime. You know, starting in the 1950s. You know, there's a lot of history on the walls of the museum. So that's what I did is I went through little by little and just chose a topic, dove into it, and you know, learned as much as I could, and then moved on to the next thing. So little by little, month by month, I just learned new things. There's a lot of great historians who work for the Mob Museum who I've learned a lot from. And so, you know, through guidance of mentors and through, reading books suggested by our historians, I've, you know, gotten a lot of information, and I still have a long way to go in that. But over the last 6 years, I've grown a lot in terms of learning about organized crime.
I could imagine. Now, if of all the different subjects that you read about, like you said, you started with prohibition. I'm sure you read about Al Capone and
Mhm.
um, Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano and so forth and so on. It's Is there any one specific ethnic group or mob, you know, family, whatever, that has appealed to you the most, that you found the most interesting?
So for me, I kind of divide it by time. The time period that really interests me most is Prohibition. That's such a fascinating time in American history. It's something that's there's nothing like the 1920s in our history. So it's something that I really enjoy diving into, learning about how everybody and their mother skirted the law in the United States by, finding a way to drink alcohol. And, the mob got heavily involved in that. So that's one of the things I like reading about the most. Other things, I really like the fringe topics that, aren't directly related to American organized crime, the mafia at the forefront, things like cybercrime. That's something that's the future of organized crime now. That's something I
Mhm.
love learning about. No longer is it, these tough wise guys. It's, a teenager in a hoodie in his bedroom, hacking people and stealing money that way. And also like uh, organized crime on a global scale. So I looking at other countries and their organized crime. For example, the Yakuza in Japan, they really interest me. That's a subject that I love learning about.
Yeah, that's a pretty complex subject to begin with.
Hmm.
Uh, was there now when I happened to be visited the Mob Museum, and I spoke with Jonathan and Jeff Schumacher, and they actually did a little show with me at one time about an ethnic mob that nobody really knows about, very little about. And I don't know if you came across it or not, but I mean, I'm Greek myself. So the Greek mob in general, when I went to the museum, wasn't even anywhere in the museum. There wasn't nothing about it. And I told John and Jeff, I said, you know what? There's one crime group you don't got here. And they looked at me like, what? Which one? What are you talking about? And I said, the Greek mob. They're like, the Greek mob? It exists? I'm like, yeah, of course it existed. Is that, have you come across that crime group at all?
It's funny you mentioned that because in my own personal research, not so much, except in one area. So we just launched a new exhibit, Mob and Pop Culture, all about mob movies, mob TV shows. And, a lot of that, I've watched a lot of it, but there's some that I haven't. And one of them is the show The Wire.
Why?
I
Yeah.
hadn't watched that. And so in the last year, I've started to watch it. And what it covers in that show is Greek organized crime. They're, the main drug suppliers in that show. And so that's something I definitely want to dive into further. And, it's something that, as a museum, we could talk more about for sure.
Yeah, well, I happen to put a book, I have a book out called Mafia Ties the Greek Syndicates, which talks about the Greek mob on a global scale. In
Oh,
America,
fascinating.
in Canada, in Greece, in Australia. It's, like I said, it's a subject that nobody really knows much about. They don't know these guys even were around because it was so low key. You know, in New York, they were big, Philly, they were big, Chicago. If I'm sure you read a lot about Chicago,
Hmm.
the number three guy in Chicago was Greek, Gus Alex. He was next to Tony Ocado and Joe Weeper. So again, it's something to something a lot of people don't really are familiar with. So outside of that, in the Mob Museum itself, because you've been there 6 years now, I'm sure the museum has evolved. Has created new things and new. I think every floor kind of added something to it. Is it anything like the crime lab you just spoke about that I didn't even know was even there? Is it anything there that currently or within the past year or two, that um, they created that's kind of new that wasn't there 5 years ago, say?
Yeah, there's actually quite a bit that's new. Like I just mentioned, we just launched a mob and pop
Oh
culture
yeah, the pop
exhibit.
culture. That's right. Yes.
So if you are someone who's very interested in mob movies, come and check that out. We have a lot of really cool artifacts on display from these movies, including things like the movie Casino. If you ever wanted to see an animatronic of Joe Pesci, definitely come check that out in our museum. We've got it on display. So that's one that's been very interesting to have in our museum. Um, you know, Other things that we've done in our museum is add more to the exhibits that we already have. For example, in our Las Vegas in the Mob exhibit, called Open City, and we have a whole new flamingo exhibit. If the last time you came to the Mob Museum was 5 years ago, this is one you haven't seen. And if it's been even further since you last came, maybe it's been 7 years since you last visited, then you haven't seen the underground. That's our whole exhibit in our basement that has our speakeasy and a distillery where we make our own award-winning moonshine.
That's pretty cool. I remember that. That I remember. Um, and you mentioned, but I remember I saw one of the articles you wrote on the Mob Museum,
Mhm.
and you wrote something about you did an article about mob movies, and I think you dissected them a little bit. I
Mhm.
believe, if I remember correctly. And a lot of these mob movies, as you probably already know, a lot of them are not accurate. They take creative license to another level. Have I'm sure you've noticed that yourself. Have you, after watching Goodfellas years ago when you were younger, and knowing what you know now, I'm sure you probably see there's a lot of inaccuracies there. Did you? Would that be true on your part?
You know, uh, that's really interesting because there's a lot of good mob movies out there that are very entertaining, but there's not a lot of factual content in there. A good example is The Untouchables. That
Oh
is a
yeah.
very great movie, but when it comes to, the stories it's based off of, all those stories didn't actually happen. But things like Goodfellas and Casino, the Martin Scorsese movies, there's of course things that have been fictionalized in those movies, like for
Big
example,
time.
all the names and places have been changed. But it's a good way of getting the meat of the story and planting a seed in people who watch it who want to know more. If you watch Casino, it's a great movie. When I watched Casino, I wanted to know more, and so that was an opportunity for me to learn the real story behind the movie Casino. And when I learned that real story, it was an opportunity to say, oh, there's actually a lot in that movie that is pretty accurate, but this is also an opportunity to learn the real story and separate that fact from fiction.
Okay. Well, of course, obviously, you've got updated with all the whole mob culture history. Um, is there a favorite movie of yours?
Favorite movie? Oh
Mob
man,
movie.
where
Is
do
there
I
a favorite
begin?
mob movie?
Yeah, so Casino is one of my favorites.
Okay.
It's just such a good history of the mob in Las Vegas, particularly in that time period, the 70s and 80s. That was the first movie I watched when I started at the Mob Museum. That was my home research, if you will. Uh, so yeah, Casino is definitely one of my favorites. I really like Scorsese's movies a lot. Another one that is not a Scorsese movie, I really like American Gangster. I think that's a fascinating movie. I really like diving into that black organized crime.
The one with Denzel Washington.
Yes, Denzel Washington. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good movie. Inaccurate, but good.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Very inaccurate, but it's very good. If you haven't have seen Donnie Brasco?
Yes, I got the chance to watch that. Yeah.
Yeah, great movie. Again, very, very inaccurate from the beginning to the end. I only say that because the character that James Russo played in the movie, you know who James Russo is, I'm sure.
Hmm.
The character he played was a friend of mine, the real guy.
Okay.
That's how I know how inaccurate it was. But it was a phenomenal movie, no doubt. Um, when it comes to the Mob Museum, and do you also um, get involved with uh, speaking engagements? Do you do that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a educational outreach program where something that is really important to us is that like to serve the Las Vegas community. We're very committed to that, and we visit schools across the county, and also senior communities and other adult groups where we give presentations about not just mob topics but also Las Vegas history topics. We're not going to elementary schools and talking to them about the St.
I
Valentine's
know, I
Day
was going
Massacre.
to
We're
say.
going to talk to them about, the history of Las Vegas, how the city got started. But when we get to the high school students, then we can start talking about, how the mob was involved in Las Vegas and things like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And I love talking to senior groups in the Valley about, various topics. We have a presentation about Al Capone that I love to talk to our senior groups about. So yeah, we do a lot of speaking engagements in the community, both in person and virtually too.
That's a very interesting thing you just said now, because a lot of the high school, that age group, and even like my son who's 26, even his age group, they know nothing about the mob. They don't even know. You say Al Capone, they look, maybe Al Capone they've heard of, but in general, you say like John Gotti, or you say like Maya Lansky, they look at you like, who? Well, who's that? You tell them The Godfather or Goodfellas. They look at you like, what are you talking about? So they really are really undereducated in
Mhm.
that area. Now, do you think that it's a subject that, like high school senior kids, like you said, or even college grads, do you believe it's something that they should know about? Or is it something that is maybe a little too violent, too, I don't know, might entice them to get involved in that world? Is that, do you think there's a fine line there?
Absolutely. So at the Mob Museum, we try very hard to not glamorize organized crime. When we started, that was something that, the community pushed back about. We don't want a museum that's going to glamorize the mob. And that's why we are the National Museum of Organized Crime and Law Enforcement. So we really try to tell a balanced story. And so when I go out to a high school and, I talk to students who, say, oh, Al Capone sounds like a pretty cool guy, but, let's learn the real history. What actually happens when you get involved in that life? How is it going to really end for you if that's a career you want to get involved in? So by teaching the real history behind these mobsters and the often the bloody fates that a lot of them ended up with, that's something that I want our young students to know that is not a life they want for them.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Is it when you present it, when you would present it that way, that it's not a life, to go down, not a road to follow. And when you present it, do you do it also, besides just speaking about it, do you use visuals, like videos, pictures, stuff like that?
Absolutely. So, we show a lot of historical photographs throughout our presentations, but we also bring artifacts into the classroom as well. So our students can get a hands-on type of history. So that really sends a message home. You can look at a slideshow and learn that way. But if you're able to handle these historical artifacts from Las Vegas casinos and from our history, that definitely leaves a greater impression. So, just by bringing those into the classroom, they're going to remember what I've been talking about because there's that tactile memory involved in that.
Well, you mentioned artifacts. What type of artifacts can they hands-on that would be hands-on? Like, what do you mean? I'm curious
Mhm.
myself.
So I'll give you an example with our St. Valentine's Day Massacre presentation. That's a presentation that is also firmly linked to forensic ballistics because that's how that case was solved. So when we go into the classroom, we're talking about the whole stage of prohibition. We have a giant flask that we bring in there. And we ask students, what do you think this is used for? And, they kind of sometimes surprised that this giant flask is something that a bootlegger would use to smuggle alcohol in, and that's then connected to the bullets from the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Now we don't have the bullets themselves; we don't bring those into the classroom; those are behind glass at the museum. But we do have 45 caliber bullets that were fired from a Thompson submachine gun that will pass around to the students so they can see what those bullets look like that might have been recovered from the crime scene. So those are the kinds of things that students will be able to see for themselves. We also have gun barrels that have been hacked so they can see what rifling actually looks like inside the barrel of the gun, so they can visualize that's what's leaving the markings on those bullets. So
Oh,
yeah,
like we
definitely leaving a
discussed
good
earlier.
impression that
Yeah, like we talked earlier. That's
way.
right, about the ballistics. Okay. And what about, do you have all, do you also show them any kind of like documents, like letters, like I know Al Capone he wrote used to write songs,
Hmm.
little things he used to do something like that. Do you show them any kind of like actual, writings that these guys wrote or things like that?
Yeah, so we in some of our presentations we have replica pages of documents. So, for example, with our Las Vegas history, our Las Vegas in the Mob presentation, we when one thing that we talk about in that presentation is the Black Book. You know, if you're in that book, you can't
You can, because it's a
own or
casino.
even enter a casino.
That's right.
And so we have the page from the Black Book that's Lefty Rosenthal's entry associated with the Stardust. And so they're able to see, you know, this guy's face, all the details about him. You don't. That's not a book you want to end up in. So they get to handle that document and see it, face to face.
Interesting. That is pretty cool. Um, but so currently, I'm not sure if you're involved with this or not, if you know about it. I know next week I'm going to be there actually. I'll be in Vegas next weekend.
Okay.
They have the Mob Summit. That Larry Henry's part of it. I'm sure you know him.
I'll be there.
Tommy Canali is. I didn't even ask Larry about this, but is the Mob Museum part of that summit or no?
So we're not partnered with the summit, but we're definitely involved. Jeff Schumacher will be giving an introduction to some of the speakers there.
Okay.
I will be there, and other staff will be there too. So
Oh,
we're
awesome.
not directly involved, but we'll be there.
Oh, awesome. Okay, I'll be there too. That'd be great. Nice to meet you as
Yeah, I
well.
look forward to meeting
Uh,
you.
well, if you want to give us something before we close the show, if give us a little bit of information of where people can find out more about what you do and where they can see your articles and things of that nature.
Yeah, so if you want to learn more about the Mob Museum or plan a visit, go to themobmuseum.org. There you can learn more about organized crime figures. You can go to our blog and read some of those. You can also, see what kind of exhibits that we have. If you are on social media, you can go find at the Mob Museum on places like Instagram, X, and Facebook. And I also want to tell everybody about our podcast. We just launched a podcast called Inside the Life. You can go to
Oh yeah,
insidethelife.org. That's a podcast produced by the Mob Museum and hosted by two former undercover agents, Giovanni
I
Rocco and
mean,
Dutch McAlpin. And so that's a fascinating podcast. They have guests from both sides of the law, talking about their life, in crime and outside of it too.
right, yeah. I know Giovanni. I know both of them. I know exactly who you're talking about.
Oh,
Actually, I'm going to have them on my show next week. As a
awesome.
matter of fact, that's pretty nice. We have a lot of we know a lot of the same thing, which is pretty awesome. Well, Zach, listen, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. I thank you. Everything you said was extremely interesting, and hopefully our listeners will check everything out that you said, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I look forward to meeting you next week. Thank you.
Sounds awesome, Zach. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Definitely appreciate you guys listening. Please like, share, and subscribe, and leave any comments you can. And we look forward to seeing you guys next time.